Well, thank you hugely, Catherine, for that, because you have been living and breathing this for a long time, obviously, and are very well connected around the world, and gave us a terrific sense of how this is panning out. Before we get going on a few questions, I just want to reiterate how to get questions to us, please. Slido, do you want me to go through Slido again, or are you all clued into Slido? That would be great. Ashley and her colleague back there have microphones, so if you want to ask a question, just flag them down, and then I'll be looking for them as to where the microphones are. And please, if you're online joining us that way, I've got I'm seeing all the Slido questions come through, and if you'll just bear with me for one moment while I just log in, and then I'll be all set to go and see the questions come in. Hang on one tick. Right. I'm ready to go. May I start actually with a slightly personal question in one sense? What was it about, or some of the key influences in your life that got you down this road? And if I may start at that point.
Sure. So it's quite a long story, actually, so I'll try to truncate it. In the mid-90s, I spent some time working just volunteering in a little village in Cameroon, up the north of the Cameroon country, and just hanging out with people and making friends. And I moved back to university in Melbourne, and having been there, within a few weeks of getting back to Melbourne, I got word that the village I'd been working in had been decimated by a flood. And my instinct was to go back very, very quickly. These were my friends in their mud huts that I wanted to go and help. And I just happened to be, and I can't even remember the conversation, how it came about, but I happened to be talking to a lecturer at the time, a woman who was an activist from East Timor, and this was a time of the sort of East Timor conflict. Her husband was in jail, and she was teaching a course on human rights that I happened to be taking, and I must have mentioned this to her, and she said to me, "Catherine, don't be so stupid." So she gave me almost a sort of metaphorical sort of slap on the wrist, and I said, "What? I've got to go back and help." And she said, "Don't be so stupid. You're a young white girl. You will get in the way." And I was like, "Oh, I just need to go. I'll peel potatoes, or I'll fill sandbags, or something. I need to help." And she said, "You're in this position where you can stay at university here. You can get all the education you can get to work on why that village was vulnerable to the flood in the first place." And those words have stayed with me ever since, to sort of not just look and respond to the downstream symptoms, important though that response is, as I've said, I don't want to denigrate that, but also to look upstream at the system. And then I did that, and then I worked looking at big mining companies and how they're related to, how they were influenced by First Nations communities around their mine site. And then I moved to Scotland, not out of any sensible career orientation, because I love Scotland. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. And when I got to Glasgow, where I lived for the last 17 years, I started seeing the life and death impact of inequality. There's a part of Glasgow not far from where I lived where life expectancy for men was about 54, in one of the richest countries in the world. And so I started asking bigger questions about the nature of the economic system, and in such a rich country in GDP terms, why were people dying before their pensionable age? And so I started looking at all these different issues that colleagues were working on, whether it was health inequalities or anti-poverty or environmental issues, and really seeing how the economy is what connected a lot of that, and starting to ask bigger questions about the economy. And then I worked for Oxfam for about 10 years. And then I got a call from Stuart Wallace, who's now the chair of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And he says he was been asked to come out of retirement to help bring together all the incredible work that's happening to transform the economy, and to help be that connective tissue between it and amplify those pioneers and create the narratives about how to change the economy. And it's an incredible privilege to do this work. It's hard and tiring, but I think there's no bigger question of our time around how we can transform our economy so that they're in service of what we need.
And thank you. That explains a lot in that sense, and then the personal journey is always very important. But very wonderfully, you got that call. So there would have been people in Scotland who were actively pursuing things and had spotted you as a person to give them a big hand.
Yeah, so Stuart Wallace, I mean, he's an incredible person. I don't know if anyone knows him. He was deputy director of Oxfam, really senior, and then he went to run the New Economics Foundation in London. He worked at big companies, and he retired then and started tending his beautiful garden in Devon and working on local permaculture projects and loving that. And then he really looked at the state of the world, and he says, we've got great evidence. There's great communications out there, but what we need is to build power bases of change and bring together all these incredible pioneers and help amplify these pioneers and take their messages up to policymaking. And so we all, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, with the fact that it shortens to we all, is a little bit like a theory of change as well. It's through collaboration, like we've never collaborated before, that we might just have a chance of turning things around in time.
And it's still a pretty select, small group of countries. Is there some kind of commonality between them, or something that makes them more liable to be members than other countries?
So there's WeGo, the governments, Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, and then there's We All, which is a multi-stakeholder alliance with the hubs, of which the New Zealand hub is one. Yeah, so WeGo, yes, it started with Scotland, New Zealand and Wales, and Scotland, New Zealand and Iceland. And at the time, all led by women, which I think a lot of people have made note of. And then Finland joined, in time that was Sanna Martin, who's just lost office. And Mark Drakeford, who's the First Minister of Wales, is a pretty good bloke. so he's allowed in too. And I think there perhaps is something significant there. Some of them are quite small countries, so if Canada comes in officially, of course, Canada is fairly substantial. But I think there is something around that we can learn, that often innovation happens at the margins. It happens in small scale. And then one of the things I'm really excited about WeGo is this idea of the threat of a good example. And I'll tell you what, this is, being back in Australia, the amount of times people who are part of the Australian conversation around doing better on measuring what matters, constantly referencing New Zealand. And I know you'd probably all say, well, we haven't cracked it yet, it's not yet good enough, we've got loads more to do. But the fact that New Zealand is trying is incredibly inspirational to Australia. And I think this is often how change happens and how innovation happens. You get these leaders at the end of the bell curve, and then you get the early adopters who start to follow them. And it's harder perhaps in a bigger country as well. I mean, my lesson from Scotland is to build a coalition around this, to build a community of practice and to build those relationships. Probably was it easier in Scotland than it may have been down in London, but then you can see Scotland showing the rest of the UK what's possible. You can see Wales with its Future Generations work, showing not just what's desirable, but also what's absolutely feasible. So there's no excuse for others not to follow.
From your conversations you've been having this week in New Zealand, what sort of progress do you think we're making? I'm going to immediately have my finger on the scale here, and we've got the budget this day next week, and my feeling is the Living Standards Framework is fine, but Treasury, although they devised it, I don't feel are really driving it very hard, and it just doesn't feel as though it's permeating or fundamentally reshaping the budget process here, or the work of government. But you've been having the sort of conversations I don't manage to have with people, given I'm a journalist and you're the person who really knows what's going on. So what's really going on?
So the last thing I want to be is an Aussie who comes over and lectures New Zealand. I know how badly that would go.
Well, how about an honorary Scot who comes?
An honorary Scot, I feel different. I would say New Zealand's made a really good start, and the key thing is to not flinch or not choke in the first half, as the Wallabies sometimes do, is to go further, recognise that budgets and measurement frameworks are only part of the picture, and measurement, things like Living Standards Framework, is not the goal in its own right. You need to make those measures matter. You need to have them permeate policy making. You need to use things like the Wellbeing Report as a good state of play of how things are, So which groups are faring well, which groups are falling behind, how's the situation of the environment? That gives you the terrain, and then you need to power in with policies and investment to attend to where things are inadequate. And so in Australia, I'm really worried they will stop at that. I mean, Australian states are doing some quite cool stuff, actually. Again, once you look under the bonnet, you see some good stuff as well. But at federal level, they're talking about measuring what matters. My worry is they won't then make those measures matter. They'll say, look, we've got a nice wellbeing framework, we've got some numbers here, but it won't connect to policy. But this is the hard task of this. I mean, it's almost like getting the statistics together is relatively straightforward. The harder task is sort of putting on the rucksack and charging up the mountain and getting them into policy making, because you need to change way government processes operate, incentive systems, how budgets are shared, how evaluations are done, timeframes of analysis, how data is shared, how individual civil servants or public servants are incentivised, and make sure they're all aligned. So I've heard, changing the State Sector Act, changing the Public Finance Act are brilliant because it's putting it into legislation. But then you also need to change how individual civil servants are encouraged to do their day job, and do they have space to go to talk to someone from a different department whose activities might influence theirs. So say, Rod, if you're head of the health department, your outcomes will not depend just on what you do. They will depend on what happens in the employment department, what happens in the housing department, what happens in the local environment department. So how do you work together? And what's brilliant, we were hearing last night that the police service is saying, actually, we don't want a bigger budget, because maybe spending on police is a sign of failure, as we were talking about with guard labour. Maybe actually the goal is powering down because people are feeling safer in the first place. So, but that's quite a mindset shift, and it requires a lot of reorientation of government processes and government heuristics and measures and targets and incentive systems. So it's not easy, and it's not surprising. So I guess this is the other message, is cut yourselves a bit of slack that you haven't cracked it in just a couple of years.
Thank you. I'm just looking in the room if there's anybody holding a microphone and want to ask a question. No? Okay, I've got some great questions online here. A couple of questions very similar about the politics of this is essentially how do you make this non-political, so it's not so one side end of the political spectrum of beating the other over the head?
So I don't think it is. If you look around the world of which governments are taking up these agendas and creating broader measures of progress, you see in Germany under Angela Merkel, in Italy, one of the forerunners of designing these different measures and outcomes orientations, led by a guy called Enrico Giovanni, who was Minister of Labour at the time, went on to become the OECD's chief statistician from right of centre parties. In the UK, it was under David Cameron, who initiated the Office of National Statistics to have a consultation on what wellbeing was. They then came up with a big, they call it their wellbeing wheel, with various dimensions of wellbeing. My complaint is they focus a little bit too narrowly on subjective self-reported wellbeing, but that was David Cameron who initiated that. Of course, it was Nicolas Sarkozy, when he was president of France, who commissioned Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, Jean-Paul Fatoussi to create the Commission on Measurement of Economic and Social Progress in 2009. So it's not necessarily one-sided politics. And it was, of course, under a previous administration here in New Zealand that the Living Standard Framework was developed. I think we can't have it just one party political, because this is about going beyond that short-term party politicking and the fighting and the responding crisis by crisis. This is about how we build the sort of country that we want for our grandchildren. I also think the extent of failure demand is something that can appeal perhaps to folks who are more concerned about the numbers and the finances. The fact that this system is failing in its own terms, that we're having to spend a lot of money downstream response treatment. So, and to me, that's not the point. To me, the point is to create societies where everyone can flourish. But the fact that there's a lot of money that's currently, I'd say, being wasted because we're not smart enough to yet build these economies, I think is a real possibility to widen the arguments out. And there's been some analysis of this there's on the WEOR website, weor.org/failure demand, some analysis of the Scottish budget, in an organisation I work with in Australia, the Centre for Policy Development, is just starting to undertake some analysis of Australian spending to try to quantify or put a decent estimate on the extent of that downstream avoidable cost.
Thank you. Now I've got a couple of questions about demographics. And the first one is about how do you engage with older people who do vote to encourage them to champion the well-being concepts, and which are not foreign concepts to most of us. What are some of the well-being ones that we just sort of intuitively are more likely to lock onto?
That's a nice question. So I'm all for consultation and public engagement and having big deliberative processes to develop what priorities are. Partly for instrumental reasons, to build a mandate and build people getting excited about this. But the thing is, those consultations, wherever they are in the world, will come up with fairly similar outcomes, because this is about fundamental human needs. These are things that make us innately human. I've been part of some consultations that when I was with Oxfam in really deprived parts of Scotland. Then replicated the project in India, and then a colleague of mine did a similar project in Namibia. So very, very different parts of the world, asking people what mattered to them. So sitting down, having a cup of tea and a conversation about what really matters to you. So when people are given a chance to pause and reflect. And what they come up with in those very, very different contexts is quite intuitive. It's things like sense of purpose and dignity, having shelter, your health, your relationships, sense of security, having enough money. People don't necessarily want extraordinary amounts of money. They want enough to participate in society and security of that income, time in nature. Those deliberative processes are reinforced by opinion polls, and I'm a bit of a geek. I collect opinion poll findings, and they are saying again and again, and particularly since COVID, that people are questioning the nature of the economic system. They're wanting to see the economy address inequalities and respond to climate change, that the various component parts of economic change are very popular, policy by policy. They're also mirrored by findings of sociologists and psychologists and even neuroscientists when they look at what makes different parts of our brain light up, what stops the stress hormone of cortisol rushing through our veins. It's when we're cooperating, it's when we're in relationships, when we feel we have control and autonomy and dignity, when we're in nature. And so from all these really diverse quarters, all these sort of different sources of evidence, you start to build a picture of some fundamental human needs. And so I think these are really speaking to what deeply matters to people. And then the question is, why don't we have an economy that's delivering that? Why is there such misalignment with the outcomes of our current economic system and what people need? And I was telling colleagues the other day, there's an American food scholar, Frances Moore Lappy, and she says, why is it that collectively we're creating a world that none of us as individuals actually want? And then that takes us into a conversation about our democratic systems and so on. The question mentioned older people.
Yes.
So yeah, there's lots of young people out being active for this, but I think older people have such a role to play, and we're seeing a lot of them out active, whether it's through their own businesses, whether they're protesting as well. I mean, there's lots of grandmas for climate and all sorts of stuff, but also there's things like how money is spent, where you invest your pension and your shares, what political parties you support, what letters you write to the editor, angry from East Auckland, what sort of things you spotlighting, how are you writing to your local councillor, and how you spend your time. Do you give back to your community? Are you mentoring folks? Are you encouraging sort of business models? Are you starting a tool library, or are you sharing your space as well? So I think, yes, often it's younger people who are seen as out there on Fridays for the Future and so on, but I think this is across the board.
And indeed, I find that on so many issues, I get engaged very well with younger people and older people, but it's the people in the middle who are just head down because they think they've sussed out the system and they're just trying to make the system work for them whilst they're in their prime that are sometimes the most resistant.
They're also the sandwich generation, aren't they? That they're sort of caring for kids and then they're caring for elderly parents as well, and they're trying to keep their, pay off their mortgage and put food on the table and deal with kids who are growing up with climate anxiety and the pressures of bullying, and looking at the fact that their living standards are flatlining compared to their parents. So I don't begrudge folk in that generation feeling a little bit scunnered, as they say in Scotland.
The other demographic question was about high net worth individuals. You're engaging with them, and how are they? Some of them are responding.
And I hear that my alma mater of Oxfam has been part of pulling out a letter today from extraordinarily high net worth individuals in New Zealand saying tax us more. And I think that's brilliant. You have billionaires around the world like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates saying the first responsibility of a rich person is to pay their taxes. There's groups like Patriotic Millionaires who are saying, this is extraordinary amount of wealth, and often it's their wealth that makes more money for them. So it's their accumulation of wealth that will make more money than you and I could earn through a salary or a wage. And so it's unearned income. And we've seen this, particularly since COVID, the gains of growth have gone to those who have assets and housing and shares. And so it's their wealth that does the heavy lifting for them. And so there's a lot of folks who are recognising that and saying, how do we contribute? Yes, paying our taxes, but there's also some people in the philanthropic world, particularly say in Europe and the States, I think, and hopefully here in New Zealand more so in the coming years, who are saying, you know what, philanthropy in the past has been part of reinforcing the current system. It's been relatively easy to fund food banks and mosquito nets and downstream charitable responses. But what might philanthropy mean when it's supporting economic system change? And so there are some incredible funders and foundations out there. The Omidyar Group, so it's the guy from eBay, they've got a beautiful series of videos on Vimeo about system change, little cartoons. I'd really recommend watching them because they're starting to grapple with what does system change really, really mean? And in really lovely language and really, nicely articulated messages. So, yeah, there are folks who are starting to get there. The other risk is when you get that confluence between financial wealth and political power, and that idea of political capture that I think is incredibly insidious. And there's all sorts of ways to attend to that through less concentration in media ownership, caps on political party donations, calling it out. Who sits around the table when we're making laws? Which accountants are advising on tax laws, or is it company? I mean, in the UK, their Food Standards Authority is made up of CEOs and advisors to some of the biggest food and beverage companies. Which is just scary at one level. So there's all those sorts of issues too. So that wealth can be used for incredibly good work, but also can be really used to undermine what we need more of.
If I may just try and make an Oxfam connection, this is a very New Zealand kind of thing. We always think everybody's related, and therefore you must have worked with Kate Raworth at the same time at Oxfam. Were you there?
Yeah, we were there together, and she left to write the book, and she passed over to me a project to say, right, how do we downscale that idea of the donut to different countries? So we did it for Scotland, Wales, the UK, South Africa, Brazil, saying what does this look like when it's translated to different localities?
I see the work you're doing and Kate's work with the donut economy as really comrades in arms. We've had Kate here in New Zealand, and indeed we have a donut economics advocate in New Zealand. And in fact, I saw a question from one of the members of that organisation here, which I'm about to ask. I think the two of you bring enormous power to and two very complementary ways of looking at things.
I'm very flattered that you put us together, because Kate's an intellectual hero of mine, also a really lovely person, and I think she's doing amazing work. And I very much see getting inside the donut as a precondition of a well-being economy. And it's incredible what I love about it. And actually, they're on a boat from Glasgow to Canberra right now. I got printed the donut on tablecloths, so that you can go into meetings and say, let's think broadly. How do different activities of a company or an NGO or a community group, how do they contribute to getting inside the donut? And I think what's really powerful about the donut is it shows again that this can't just be about the environment, or it can't just be about health or social justice issues. We need to see these things together, whether it's understanding the patterns of their root causes and the interconnections, but also being really bold and ambitious in terms of how we respond to these challenges, and not just see isolated responses, but say how can we have and multiple benefits. But yeah, Kate's incredibly inspiring. They've just come out, for anyone who's in business here, with a business guide of sort of how do you translate the ideas of donut economics, and it's led by another ex-farmer, we call ourselves, from the if you're from Oxfam and you're ex-Oxfam, you're part of the X-family. It's naff, isn't it? And yeah, from a guy called Erinç Sahan, who also is he's an Australian-Turkish guy, and so he's now working with Kate to do this beautiful work of saying, how do we translate these ideas to businesses? And there's some beautiful workshop guides that we can use. Kate's also an ambassador of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, as is Sophie Howe. She's now just joined as a trustee, actually. Yeah. So when you see her in a few months, you'll know that she's one of the trustees of We All Global.
Fantastic, thank you. A question here, thank you.
Kia ora. Hey, thanks so much for your insights and presentation. It's electrifying and energising. It's fantastic. So in Aotearoa here, we have some incredibly successful banks, and it's the thing that's happening around the world. I'm wondering, I suppose it's quite pointy really, but I'm just kind of curious as to how banks might be encouraged to participate in a wellbeing economy. Are there examples of that, or models that could be set up? And it's and banks have a massive power, and so often you hear from some of the leaders of these enterprises, like social enterprises or worker co-ops, that they go to their bank and say, help, we need some financial investment to get going, to buy equipment or set up shop. And banks just say, look at them blankly. Don't understand. What do you mean workers own the business? Or what do you mean you've got a social purpose? Don't understand that. And I think that's really sad and outdated thinking. But then there are banks who are starting to say, we have a very positive, constructive role to play here. And so the example of Triodos Bank in the Netherlands is a good example of that. There's Bendigo Bank in Australia. And of course sorry? I'll have to check them out. They've probably come about since I was last there. And also in Germany, they have much more regional banking system. So it's not these big, massive multinationals where you have every decision's made on a computer, but it's more old style community banking. So I think, again, and I'd say this more broadly about the whole financial system, finance is almost the plumbing, or maybe the energy is a better way of saying it, the energy of the new economy. And so we need to channel that finance to the sort of activities that we need to see in a better economy. And there are some incredible, and I'm a bit squeamish about impact investors, the impact investing agenda to a degree, but when people are starting to say, we've got to look beyond financial returns. Tim Jackson, who's one of the great thinkers in prosperity without growth, he heads up something called this Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity. He says we should see investment in a financial investment sense as commitment, not as a rent-seeking device to generate financial returns, but as commitment to an activity that we want to support. So there's some great examples of folks in the investment community who are absolutely grappling with these questions, and I hear from a lot of them. They're really saying, how do we go beyond quarters? I've just been invited to speak to one of the big pension funds in Edinburgh, a group called Baillie Gifford, who are massive, and they're saying we're struggling with this. We're asking similar questions. Come and help us with that. So it is really heartening that there's a lot of folk within these systems who are asking big questions and trying to figure out how do they utilise what they have at their disposal to be part of the solution. And again, it's sort of like that second to last, that last slide. I think everyone's got something to play here, and I absolutely see, finance has got to be come to the party.
Last question. I'm just going to loop back to Scotland, and this is the question from the person here in the room who's a member of Donut Economics Advocates New Zealand. And it's the hard question that always needs to be asked. What indicators or statistics in Scotland show the well-being economy strategy is actually working?
Yeah. So the challenge here is that they haven't built a wellbeing economy in Scotland yet. What they've got is little pieces of that jigsaw puzzle in place, but huge headwinds against that, whether it's because of the COVID or austerity for the last decade, but also because they also counteract those good pieces of the jigsaw puzzle with what they're doing with the other hand. So there's an incoherence and an inconsistency, which means if I was a government minister here, I would come up and I'd read you out the bullet point of the cool things that we're doing, and you'd think, oh, that's great, there's a lot. But what I wouldn't tell you is how that was being offset by other activities, and more investment in oil and gas, or more undermining of workers' rights, or so on. And so, in a way, it's too early to see, because one, we're not yet created a wellbeing economy. There's these huge headwinds, and there's an inconsistency and incoherence in implementation. That said, we see at companies like Green City Whole Foods that I mentioned, who have been around for decades, that are really successful. So they're doing something right there. We see in Preston, where I was saying that mental health is going up, as evidenced by work of the Lancet, their most resilient city. So I think there are hints that we see that this can work. But I mean, Scotland certainly, their levels of poverty have been pretty consistent over the last few decades, which shows those recipes that have been reached for again and again have had their chance and are definitely not working. So it's time to experiment and think things anew and be a bit bold in how you try to attend to some of those problems.
Which is the perfect cue for me to hand the microphone to Gareth about the conference here, because this is a fabulous opportunity for us here in New Zealand to explore this some more. So, Gareth, over to you.
Kia ora, Namihinui, kia koutou, kia ora. I'm Gareth Hughes, the country lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Aotearoa. I just want to thank Auckland Conversations for this wonderful event. Rod, Catherine, I've been on the road the last 3 days with Catherine. We've been meeting with ministers, members of parliament, councillors, academics, economists, the public, the media, and what's been really interesting is the major question everyone's been asking is, well, how do we do it? How do we get there? Not a single person has said the system's working. The business as usual is the way we need to continue. Everyone wants to know how we get there. So I'd like to invite you to join us to continue this conversation, to focus on the solutions. So the Economy for Public Good conference is going to be August 31st at AUT University in Auckland. What we're going to be doing is asking for the first time possibly in New Zealand's history a conference entirely focused on how do we redesign the economy so it works for people and planet. How do we have an economy that delivers for the public good? We'll be shining a spotlight on Māori and Indigenous approaches, donut economics, degrowth economics, steady state economics, ecological economics. There are so many solutions out there, from business to what's happening in towns and cities across the country. So please join us. It's entirely focused on the solutions. We're also going to be putting the politicians' feet to the fire. This is going to be a matter of weeks before our general election. And this might be one of the few chances, and I encourage you all to also question candidates this election, to challenge them to think systemically, to ask them, are they this election focusing on the symptoms, or are they focusing on the systems? Are they just coming up with failure demand solutions and band-aids, or are they really coming up with what we need to redesign our economy for it works for the public good? So check out our website, weall.org/hubs/New Zealand. Also, if you just Google Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa, you'll get a link to the Economy for Public Good conference. This is going to be really important, it's going to be really fun, and it's going to be really inspiring. So please join us. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much indeed, Gareth, and thank you once again for making it possible for Catherine to come and join us. And I know there's still questions out there that I haven't asked, but I need to draw this to a close. So a final sort of call, I was about to say to arms, that's far too militaristic, but a final, injunction to us on this about how we can really get going on this and start to make a very big difference.
So I'll just say again, channel your inner 3-year-old. Don't be content just to take symptom by symptom downstream action. Recognise that we can do better than that. We can absolutely change the operating system. We can change how the economy is designed because it's been done before. You've all got a role to play in that, no matter where you are in the system and what you're angry about or where your energy takes you. Jump on the Wellbeing Economy Alliance website, sign up, be part of We All New Zealand, because there's loads of cool stuff happening there. But also take these conversations out there, because I think so often we're forbidden for having these discussions. We're forbidden from asking bigger, harder questions about the economy. So keep asking, you know, and keep channeling that inner 3-year-old and daring to ask, but why, but why, but why?
Indeed. And the Auckland Conversations team, standing there at the back, had a particular ask for me to put on their behalf. If you've got more questions about all this and you'd like to know, for example, what's going on in Auckland Council that reflects any of this, please do have a word with them afterwards, and they'll take down your questions and try and get some answers for you. Please do share this discussion with people once you get an email telling you that this recording is now up live on the Auckland Conversations website. And I hope this is very much just the start of a much fuller conversation. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for sharing your great knowledge and passion on this with us. A big hand for Catherine, please. Thank you very much indeed.